Imagine this. You wake up tomorrow morning and decide to become unreachable. Not physically, you're still there, breathing, existing in the same world as everyone else. But something fundamental has shifted. Your phone remains silent by choice. Your calendar clears itself of obligations that once felt urgent. The endless stream of requests, demands, and expectations that normally flood your consciousness suddenly meets an impenetrable wall of nothing. At first, the silence feels foreign, almost violent in its completeness. Your nervous system, conditioned by years of perpetual availability, begins to revolt. Your hand reaches instinctively for the phantom vibration of notifications that never come. You feel the peculiar anxiety of a person who has spent so long being everything to everyone that the absence of demand feels like the absence of identity itself. But then something extraordinary begins to happen. Something that defies everything you've been taught about success, relationships, and your place in the world. The people who once consumed your energy with casual urgency suddenly reveal their true nature. Some disappear entirely. Their friendship exposed as nothing more than convenient access to your resources. Others, surprisingly, begin to approach you with a different kind of respect, the kind reserved for something valuable that cannot be taken for granted. And most shocking of all, you discover that your absence from their immediate reach doesn't diminish your importance in their lives, it amplifies it. This is the great paradox that Carl Jung understood at the deepest level of human psychology. The moment you stop being available to everyone is the moment you become truly available to yourself. And in that availability to yourself, you become more valuable to others than you ever were when you gave yourself away freely. But why does this feel so counterintuitive? Why does every fiber of your social conditioning scream that withdrawal equals selfishness? That boundaries equal cruelty? That protecting your energy equals abandoning those who need you? You've been living under a magnificent illusion, one so pervasive and deeply embedded in the fabric of modern existence that questioning it feels like questioning gravity itself. This illusion whispers that your worth is measured by your availability, that love is proven through accessibility, that success is demonstrated by how many people can reach you at any moment of any day. Yet consider this disturbing reality. The most available people in your life are often the least respected. The friend who drops everything for everyone becomes the one whose time is valued least. The parent who sacrifices every boundary becomes the one whose children feel least grateful. The professional who says yes to every request becomes the one whose expertise is taken for granted. How is it possible that the very behavior we've been told demonstrates care and commitment actually diminishes our influence and erodes our relationships? How can it be that in trying to be everything to everyone, we become nothing to anyone, including ourselves? The answer lies in a psychological principle so fundamental that it governs everything from personal relationships to global economics, yet remains invisible to those trapped within its mechanism. It's a force that shapes not just how others see you, but how you see yourself. It determines whether you approach life from a position of power or a position of desperation, whether your choices come from authentic desire or compulsive obligation. This force operates according to an ancient law that Jung recognized in the depths of the human psyche. That which is always available becomes invisible, and that which is invisible loses its power to transform. When you make yourself endlessly accessible, you don't increase your value in the world, you make yourself disappear from it. But what happens when you reverse this equation? What occurs in the space between availability and absence? What emerges when you stop filling every silence with your presence and start allowing the world to feel what it's like when you're not there? The answer will challenge everything you think you know about relationships, success, and the very nature of human connection itself. The roots of this psychological trap run deeper than you might imagine, threading through the very foundations of how civilization has conditioned you to exist. To understand why you've been programmed to equate availability with virtue, you must first recognize that you're living within what Carl Jung called the collective unconscious, a shared psychological space where ancient survival patterns still dictate modern behavior even when those patterns have become destructive. Consider the evolutionary origins of this compulsion. For thousands of years, your ancestors survived by being part of the tribe. Exclusion meant death. The human nervous system developed an exquisite sensitivity to social rejection, creating what psychologists now call rejection sensitivity, a hypervigilance to any sign that you might be pushed outside the protective circle of community acceptance. Your availability became your insurance policy against abandonment. But here's where the ancient wisdom becomes modern poison. The world has changed, but your nervous system hasn't. You're still running software designed for small tribal groups in an age of infinite digital connectivity. The result is a psychological catastrophe that most people mistake for normal life. Jung understood this conflict between our evolved psychology and modern demands when he wrote about the persona, the mask we wear to navigate social expectations. But what Jung recognized, and what most people miss, is that the persona isn't just a mask you put on. It becomes a prison you can't take off. When your availability becomes your identity, you lose access to what Jung called your authentic self, the part of you that exists independent of others' needs and expectations. Friedrich Nietzsche saw this same dynamic from a different angle when he wrote about the slave morality that convinces people to find virtue in their own diminishment. The person who prides themselves on always being available, always saying yes, always putting others first, is often someone who has internalized a value system that glorifies self-sacrifice while secretly resenting the very people they claim to serve. This resentment isn't accidental, it's inevitable. When you make yourself constantly available, you create what Arthur Schopenhauer identified as the fundamental source of human suffering, the endless cycle of desire and fulfillment that never leads to lasting satisfaction. Others learn to expect your availability, then demand it, then take it for granted. What began as your gift to the world becomes your burden, and what you thought would earn you love actually breeds contempt, both from others and from yourself. The psychological mechanism behind this transformation is what modern researchers call hedonic adaptation, the tendency for any consistent pleasure or comfort to become invisible through familiarity. When you're always available, your presence loses its specialness. You become like air, essential for life, but noticed only when absent. Jean-Paul Sartre captured this existential trap when he explored how we often define ourselves through the gaze of the other, constantly modifying our behavior based on how we imagine others perceive us. The chronically available person lives in a state of perpetual performance anxiety, never knowing who they are when no one is watching because someone is always watching. Your identity becomes a reflection of others' needs rather than an expression of your own nature. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of this psychological pattern is how it corrupts your relationship with your own desires. Viktor Frankl, who survived the Nazi concentration camps, observed that the human spirit can endure almost any suffering if it has meaning and choice. But when you're constantly available to others, you gradually lose touch with your own will. You become what Aldous Huxley called a soma addict, someone who medicates their existential pain through the temporary high of being needed, wanted, and appreciated. This creates a vicious cycle that Jung would have recognized as a form of psychological possession. The more you give yourself away, the emptier you feel. The emptier you feel, the more desperately you seek validation through giving yourself away. You become addicted to your own availability because it's the only way you know how to feel valuable. The tragedy is that this pattern doesn't just harm you, it harms everyone around you. When you have no boundaries, you teach others to have no respect. When you say yes to everything, your yes becomes meaningless. When you're always there, your presence loses its power to heal, inspire, or transform. This is why Jung emphasized the crucial importance of what he called individuation, the process of becoming who you actually are, rather than who others expect you to be. But individuation requires something that feels impossible to the chronically available person. It requires the courage to disappoint others in service of your own authenticity. The question that emerges from this psychological labyrinth is both simple and terrifying. What would happen if you stopped volunteering for your own diminishment? What would change if you reclaimed the right to be selectively available, not as an act of cruelty, but as an act of self-preservation, and ultimately, genuine service to the world? The most insidious aspect of chronic availability isn't what it does to your schedule, it's what it does to your mind. While you've been busy responding to every ping, every request, every emotional emergency that others have learned to bring to your door, something far more sinister has been happening beneath the surface of your consciousness. You've been training your brain to exist in a state of perpetual reaction, and in doing so, you've accidentally rewired your neural pathways to make deep thought, creative breakthrough, and authentic self-knowledge nearly impossible. Neuroscience reveals a disturbing truth about the constantly available mind. It develops what researchers call continuous partial attention, a state where you're simultaneously engaged with multiple inputs but never fully present to any of them. Your brain, designed to focus deeply on single tasks, becomes scattered across a dozen different demands. The result isn't just inefficiency, it's a fundamental alteration of your cognitive architecture. When you're always available, your brain never gets the chance to enter what neuroscientists call the default mode network, the state of neural activity that occurs during rest and introspection. This isn't merely downtime, it's when your mind consolidates memories, makes creative connections, and engages in the kind of self-reflection that Jung considered essential for psychological development. Without access to this state, you become cognitively impoverished, living on the surface of your own experience. But the consequences extend far beyond your individual psychology. Consider what happens to your relationships when you remove the element of anticipation, effort, and uncertainty from human connection. When people know they can reach you instantly, at any time, for any reason, they stop valuing the interaction itself. Your constant availability creates what psychologists call learned helplessness in others. They become dependent on your responsiveness rather than developing their own capacity for problem-solving and emotional regulation. This dynamic destroys the very foundation of healthy relationships, reciprocity. When you're always the one who responds, always the one who's there, always the one who accommodates, you create an asymmetrical power structure where others consume your energy without feeling obligated to reciprocate. They begin to see you not as an equal, but as a resource, something to be used rather than someone to be respected. When you model chronic availability, you teach them that boundaries are selfish, that self-care is cruel, and that their worth depends on how much they can sacrifice for others. You raise them to become the next generation of people who mistake exhaustion for virtue and wonder why they feel empty despite doing everything right. The professional consequences are equally profound. In a culture that celebrates the always-on worker, you might think constant availability would advance your career. The opposite is true. Research in organizational psychology consistently shows that the most available employees are often the least respected and the most likely to be passed over for leadership positions. Why? Because availability signals desperation, not competence. Leaders are people who guard their time and attention, not those who scatter it freely. Your constant availability also triggers what social psychologists call reactance theory, the psychological phenomenon where people value what they can't easily access more than what they can. When you're always there, you remove the natural human tendency to appreciate and pursue what feels scarce or valuable. You become psychologically invisible through your very visibility. Perhaps most tragically, chronic availability robs you of what Jung called the transcendent function, the psychological process through which conflict and tension lead to growth and insight. When you're constantly responding to external demands, you never sit with your own discomfort long enough for it to transform into wisdom. You become addicted to the dopamine hit of solving other people's problems because it allows you to avoid the more difficult work of confronting your own. The cultural implications are staggering. A society of chronically available people creates what sociologist Sherry Turkle calls alone together, a paradox where everyone is connected but nobody is truly present. The result is epidemic levels of anxiety, depression, and existential emptiness, even among people who are surrounded by others and seemingly have everything they need. Your availability addiction also feeds what economist Tim Jackson identifies as the growth imperative of modern capitalism, the endless need for more consumption, more productivity, more engagement. When you can't say no, you become a perfect consumer of experiences, relationships, and responsibilities. You lose the capacity for what the ancient Greeks called ataraxia, tranquil self-sufficiency that doesn't depend on external validation or stimulation. The most haunting consequence of all is how chronic availability erodes what Jung called your shadow work, the crucial psychological process of acknowledging and integrating the parts of yourself that you've disowned or rejected. When you're always focused outward, always responding to others, you never have to face the uncomfortable truth of who you really are beneath your helpful, accommodating persona. The path to freedom begins with a single, revolutionary act that will feel like betrayal to every conditioned cell in your body. You must learn to disappoint people on purpose. Not out of cruelty, not out of selfishness, but out of a deeper understanding that your unavailability is often the greatest gift you can give to both yourself and others. This isn't about becoming cold or distant. This is about recognizing that true power, the kind that Jung called authentic self-expression, only emerges when you stop being a slave to other people's expectations and start honoring what he termed the inner voice. But how do you distinguish between the inner voice and the chorus of external demands that have been masquerading as your conscience for so long? The answer lies in what Jung called active imagination, the practice of deliberately creating space between stimulus and response. When someone makes a request of your time, attention, or energy, instead of automatically responding with yes or no, you pause. In that pause, you ask yourself a question that cuts through decades of conditioning. Is this request aligned with who I'm becoming, or is it asking me to remain who I've always been? This simple question reveals something profound. Most requests for your availability are actually invitations to remain small, predictable, and controllable. People have become accustomed to a version of you that serves their needs, and they will unconsciously resist any evolution that threatens their access to your resources. Consider how the most transformative figures in history practice strategic unavailability. Carl Jung himself disappeared for months at a time to his tower in Bollingen, where he engaged in the deep psychological work that would later revolutionize our understanding of the human psyche. He understood that breakthrough thinking requires what he called creative solitude, not just being alone, but being alone with intention. Einstein's greatest insights came during his long, solitary walks. Darwin's revolutionary ideas emerged during his years of relative isolation. Virginia Woolf insisted on having a room of one's own, not as luxury, but as psychological necessity. These weren't anti-social acts, they were acts of service to something larger than immediate social demands. The rebellion against chronic availability requires what military strategists call tactical retreat. stepping back not to surrender, but to gain perspective and strength. This means developing what Jung called the capacity to hold tension, the ability to sit with others' disappointment without immediately rushing to fix it or explain it away. When you first begin practicing selective availability, you'll discover something both terrifying and liberating. Most people's urgent needs are actually chronic patterns of outsourcing their own emotional regulation. The friend who calls you in crisis every week isn't experiencing a series of emergencies. They're avoiding developing their own capacity for self-soothing. The colleague who constantly needs your input isn't struggling with particularly difficult problems. They're afraid of taking responsibility for their own decisions. Your unavailability forces others to develop their own psychological muscles. This isn't abandonment, it's empowerment. When you stop being their emotional crutch, they're forced to discover their own strength. Many will initially resist this gift, but those who truly care about you will eventually thank you for it. The practical implementation of this rebellion requires what Jung called conscious suffering, the willingness to experience short-term discomfort for long-term growth. You must learn to tolerate the anxiety that comes with disappointing others, the guilt that emerges when you prioritize your own needs, and the fear that you might be abandoned if you're not constantly useful. This is where most people fail in their attempt to reclaim their availability. They treat boundary setting as a technique rather than a spiritual practice. They try to become less available while still seeking approval for their unavailability. True rebellion requires what Jung called individuation, the courage to become who you actually are, even if that person is someone others don't recognize or appreciate. The most powerful tool in this rebellion is what ancient Stoics called the discipline of desire, learning to want what serves your highest development rather than what provides immediate relief from social pressure. When someone asks for your time, instead of asking how can I help, start asking how does this serve my authentic growth and theirs. This shift in questioning reveals that much of what we call helping is actually enabling. True help often requires temporary unavailability, creating space for others to discover their own solutions, develop their own resilience, and respect your boundaries. The rebellion also requires understanding that your time and attention are not neutral resources. They carry your life force, your creative potential, your capacity for love and transformation. When you give them away carelessly, you're not just losing hours, you're fragmenting your soul across countless demands that may have nothing to do with your purpose. Jung understood that the individuation process, becoming who you truly are, requires what he called separation from the collective. This doesn't mean becoming a hermit. It means developing the capacity to choose your engagements based on your own values rather than others' expectations. The ultimate rebellion is recognizing that your unavailability is not a limitation you impose on others. It's a gift you give to the world. When you become selectively available, your presence becomes precious rather than assumed. Your input becomes valued rather than expected, and your energy becomes transformative rather than merely transactional. Here is the truth that will shatter everything you thought you knew about human connection. Your chronic availability hasn't been an act of love, it's been an act of fear. And the moment you recognize this, everything changes. Jung spent decades exploring what he called the shadow, the parts of ourselves we hide not just from others but from our own conscious awareness. The shadow of the chronically available person isn't anger or selfishness as you might expect. It's terror, the bone-deep terror of being truly seen, truly known, and potentially rejected for who you actually are beneath all your helpful accommodations. Your availability has been your hiding place. Every time you rush to solve someone's problem, every time you say yes when you mean no, every time you prioritize someone else's needs over your own inner voice, you're engaging in what Jung would recognize as a sophisticated form of psychological camouflage. You're using your helpfulness to avoid the vulnerability of authentic presence. This is the ultimate paradox. In trying to ensure that you're never rejected, you've rejected yourself so completely that no one has ever had the chance to accept or reject the real you. You've been in relationship with everyone while being known by no one, including yourself. When you finally step into selective availability, something profound happens that transcends all the practical benefits we've discussed. You begin to discover what Jung called the self. Not the ego that seeks approval and validation, but the deeper essence that exists independent of others' opinions and needs. This self doesn't need to be constantly useful to feel valuable. It doesn't need to be perpetually accessible to feel loved. It simply is. From this place of authentic being, your relationships transform in ways that defy conventional logic. The people who remain in your life after you become selectively available aren't just those who respect your boundaries, they're those who are capable of genuine intimacy. Because intimacy isn't possible with someone who has no inner life, no mystery, no autonomous existence that exists separate from your needs of them. When you stop being available to everyone, you become truly available to the few people who matter most. But more importantly, you become available to the person who matters most of all, the authentic self that has been waiting patiently beneath all your accommodations for permission to exist. This is where Jung's deepest insight emerges. The process of individuation, becoming who you truly are, isn't a selfish act. It's the most generous thing you can do for the world. Because when you stop fragmenting your energy across countless superficial connections and start concentrating it within your authentic being, you become a source of what Jung called numinous energy, the kind of presence that transforms everything it touches. People will feel this transformation before they understand it. Your words will carry more weight because they come from a deeper place. Your presence will feel more substantial because it's no longer diluted across infinite availability. Your love will feel more powerful because it's chosen rather than compulsive. But perhaps the most revolutionary realization is this. When you stop being chronically available, you don't lose your capacity to help others. You gain the ability to help them in ways that actually matter. Instead of enabling their dependency, you model independence. Instead of solving their problems, you inspire their strength. Instead of being their crutch, you become their catalyst. This is the profound truth that Jung understood about human psychology. We don't transform through having our needs constantly met. We transform through being challenged to meet our own needs. Your unavailability becomes a gift that forces others to discover resources within themselves they never knew existed. The ultimate truth is that your chronic availability was never about serving others. It was about avoiding the terror of discovering who you are when you're not being useful to someone else. The moment you begin to withdraw that availability, you're forced to confront the question that lies at the heart of Jung's entire body of work. Who are you when you're not performing for anyone else's approval? This question is both the most terrifying and the most liberating inquiry you can make. Because on the other side of that terror lies something magnificent. The discovery that you are enough, exactly as you are, without doing anything for anyone. Your worth isn't earned through availability, it's inherent in your being. When you finally understand this, not intellectually, but in the depths of your bones, everything changes. You stop seeking validation through usefulness and start offering value through authenticity. You stop trying to be everything to everyone and start being something real to yourself. You stop living in reactive mode and start creating from the depths of your own vision. The world doesn't need another person who says yes to everything. It needs someone who says yes to their own truth with such conviction that it gives others permission to do the same. Your selective availability isn't a withdrawal from the world. It's a gift to the world. It's the gift of your authentic presence, undiluted by the compulsive need to please, uncorrupted by the fear of rejection, and unlimited by the boundaries that once defined your identity. When you stop being available to everything, you become available to what matters, and what matters ultimately is the unique contribution that only you can make to existence, but only if you're brave enough to stop hiding behind your helpfulness and start showing up as who you really are. This is Carl Jung's ultimate life lesson. Your unavailability isn't selfishness, it's the foundation of your service to the world.